Hello fellow egoists! In today's video we'll be talking about Nagi's possible fate for after the NEL and why his story may become one of absolute peak, if I may say. Of course, as you saw in the title, we'll be working with the idea of Nagi getting locked off, but where does that idea come from exactly? And what are the hints to it? First off, it is the surprise of no one that Nagi is currently treading on a dangerous path with having gotten only one goal in the NEL and things not looking to get better in the story so far. Though what is the basis for theorizing that Nagi is going to get a downfall even harder than this? Well, it all ties back to the most important thing for players in the NEL. How well do they apply the Master Striker's advice and philosophy to themselves? To understand what exactly I mean by that, we need to look at the other quote-unquote main strikers of each team, and then we'll see that the success they have is directly related to how well they apply the advice and philosophy from their own Master Striker. For Bachira, the advice was for him to embrace his originality further, to become one with the monster and evolve with it, which led to Bachira constantly being at the top of the leaderboards in the NEL and generally becoming one of the best players Blue Lock has to offer, with him even being able to score a super goal against Ubers, while surely being targeted by Lorenzo, something that Kaiser needed Isagi to do as a means to understand how huge of a feat this is. Similarly, Noah's advice was for Isagi to embrace rationality, to constantly aim to become the best in the world at every moment of his existence. And we've been seeing how Isagi has grown through all of this. So what happens when a player doesn't follow their main striker's advice? Well, we get Barrow. While Barrow is currently the number 2 player of Blue Lock with a bid of 150 million, meaning that in the following 2 matches Barrow's increase in bids was cut in half compared to his first match. And what happened exactly in the match where he faced off against Isagi, which is when that slump started? Barrow went against Snuffy's philosophy and more specifically Snuffy's personal advice, for Barrow to embrace himself outside of football and his genius, to not base his whole personality and sense of self around his king persona, something that isn't always stable and could make him fall in an instant if not managed well enough. A notion that Barrow went against fully by shouting not only to Snuffy but also himself that if the day comes where I can't become number 1 in the world, I'd rather go out in a blaze of glory. Something that is basically a raw copy of Mick Moon's speech and the essence of what led to his death. Something that may await the villainous King Barrow if he isn't careful with how he manages his ego. Something that was already prophesied to us in a certain extent in episode Nagi, and I want you to pay close attention to this detail. So with Barrow's example, we see that going against your Master Striker's personal advice will surely send you in a downfall similar to what they have told you, and so we can ask ourselves, what was Nagi's choice? By this point, I think everyone knows the answer. Nagi rejected Chris Prince's advice, though we need to understand what exactly was this advice, and especially because a lot of people tend to misunderstand what it means. To quote Chris Prince, "You got almost no points in creativity. It's probably because you've just been focused on receiving passes until now, and during games you're making incredible reactions moment to moment. It's a passive style of football influenced by your partner's quality. So what I would suggest is for you to play more actively." The important thing to highlight is, in this advice, Nagi isn't necessarily uncreative, but rarely tries to actually create his plays, rather he only responds to them. But that doesn't mean that Nagi can't create plays with his own ideal in mind. The best example of this is in the Team Z match of the first selection, where Nagi was shown to be an unbeatable force of nature when awakened, and you'll know that during those moments he was the one actively starting plays. Similarly, in the 2v2 against Barrow and Naruhaya, you see that Nagi was actively asking for a pass from Isagi with a certain idea in mind and then executing it. This is why Chris Prince's almost no point in creativity is important. Nagi isn't a player that always relies on others, but he does have a tendency to do it. The second detail that needs to be highlighted is the fact that Chris Prince's advice isn't for Nagi to start playmaking by not focusing on receiving passes, but rather to actively ask for passes with his own ideal in mind. And when Nagi fully delved into this advice while having an objective that fit with his ego, what happened? He scored his 5-stage fake volley, passing to Reo while fully trusting him to pass to where Nagi's dream could be, Nagi directly asking to Reo for him to help him beat Isagi, a play which Nagi directly went into after passing, which is why we see him immediately going to Isagi without even seeing the ball, since he trusted that Reo would understand what he was going for. Though, quick pause before we move on further with this video, but this pass wasn't something similar to Hiyori and Isagi and what they did in the Ubers match. Here what happened is that Ryo passed to where Nagi wanted, even if Nagi went to that spot without looking and expecting the ball to come, so it doesn't feel to the case of Ryo and Nagi moving towards the same shared dream. So now that we understand this advice properly and how by applying it Nagi had turned into a world-class player, we can also see how exactly Nagi went against it. While he didn't go against Chris Priest's advice when he did the 5-stage fake volley and he actually applied the advice, he started going against it later on when getting back with Ryo. During the play before the 5-stage fake volley, we see Nagi being content with following Ryo's ideal, which isn't inherently wrong all the time, and you can do it once in a while, but this tendency continues even past this play. We see how Nagi starts to throw away Chris Priest's system along with him getting codependent again with Ryo, making it that Nagi ends up being unable to think properly when in front of the goal and needing Ryo to scream at him for anything to happen. Though this doesn't stand only from the fact that Nagi plays passively again, but more importantly the fact that he's not going against only Chris Priest's personal advice but also his philosophy. As we saw with Barrow's advice, Snuffy's philosophy was about creating a stronghold for your career. Something more than just ego and passion, something that can't always get you through obstacles just by itself. A possibility that Barrow may need to face later on in his career since he went directly against Snuffy's philosophy. And similarly for Nagi, by going against Chris Priest's philosophy, one that aims for you to create an ideal through understanding yourself and your talent, to gain self-awareness of who you are as a player and basing your ideal on it, Nagi may face a situation that this philosophy helps you avoid. That is, to quote Chris Prince, yearning for power without understanding its mechanisms and then getting an unbalanced body through reckless training will cause your talent to wither away. Then you lose confidence, become mentally unstable, and lose your life as a player. The same is true no matter what your talent is. This is how prodigies fade away. Experiencing success without understanding the mechanism for that success will become a curse that tortures you. And by now this should definitely ring a bell. Nagi, by going against Chris Priest's advice but still gaining success by fulfilling his dream of beating Isagi without understanding what exactly could drive him past this goal, what is the essence of his desires to say, has put himself in a situation where this success will become a curse. Something that we've been seeing so far with Nagi saying that his fire has gone away, that he's lost. And the manga even immediately reminded us that Nagi's goal, which came from about without understanding himself nor his talent, a fluke goal to call it clearly, brings him ever so close to a ruination, a place where the depth of his ego will be tested. So with this we see that the setups for Nagi facing a downfall bigger than what he is currently experiencing will come. But why exactly could it be a lock-off rather than him just being at the bottom in the U20 World Cup for example? Well, for this we need to look at his own story, the spin-off of Blue Lock, episode Nagi. In the chapter 19 of it we have Hiragi, Nico and Zentetsu coming to ask for a face-off against Nagi's team. But not before Hiragi does a tarot reading of Nagi's team. Now if you remember correctly we talked about how Barrow's tarot card was the Hanged Man, indicating that Barrow's future trial and new self would be related to endurance, growth through trial, and most importantly, that curbing his ego in the midst of endurance will be the key to his new self, clearly reminding us of Snuffy's advice for Barrow, of basing his sense of self outside of his ego. What about Nagi's tarot card? Well, let's say it clearly, our dear White Furball gets the card of Death, one of the strongest cards in tarots in terms of value, holding in its meaning ceasing, separation, and game over. While you may follow Hiragi's line of thought about it being right now and this being the best time for crushing Nagi, and that Nagi's immediate thought about this was about Ryo breaking off from him, this card isn't actually related to this exact moment. The reason is simply that if we look at the timeline from the main manga, we learn that Zentetsu was actually the fourth player to be taken into Nagi's team, meaning that Nagi's team actually won against Hiragi and stole Zentetsu from him. So in this sense, the card of Death is not put into action for this instance, and similarly there are no Nagi-centric moments in the main manga up until the Menshine match. Though an interesting thing for the meaning given to the Death card by Hiragi is that it's not only about ceasing and game over but also separation. And what have we been getting hints of in the main manga? Ryo potentially breaking off from Nagi in an attempt to keep himself in the top 23. As we see, with each match and Ryo's value going lower and lower, he seems more stressed, and the story telling us through Agi that Ryo and Nagi will need to change and break off if they want to grow, to break the cycle of codependence that they currently have going on. Does that ring a bell? A one-winged angel, unable to fly. A Nagi whose codependency runs so deep that he's unable to do anything without Ryo. A danger of ruination coming ever so near, and finally, game over. As seen before, one of the reasons that Nagi would need to get locked off is that he's going against the philosophy of his environment. Not even trying to adapt to it or change it, but directly going against it by himself and with Ryo. Which should normally lead to him failing to a certain extent, but even deeper than this, Nagi is actively going against the Blue Lock philosophy as a whole. The same way that Chris Priest's philosophy is about self-awareness of your talent, Blue Lock philosophy is about understanding of your ego, and using it to push your talent even further. In this sense, we can look at the way Nagi applied the advice from Rin and Barrow, two of the best Blue Lock players and therefore two of the players that follow best Blue Lock's philosophy. Rin's advice wasn't directly for Nagi, but it was specifically about him writing his own story, something that Nagi should do, and then telling to Nagi that he'll go to hell. Similarly, Barrow's advice was for Nagi to stop using a fake and borrowed ego, and that Nagi should go die and come back afterwards. That his current way of doing things won't cut it during and past the NEL. And what does Nagi do with those advices? He judges that he doesn't have time to delve deeper into his problems of ego, and decides to instead ask Ryo for help, for Ryo to give him a new hit, a new ego, going the total opposite way of what Rin and Barrow's advices were, and therefore against what Blue Lock stands for in terms of philosophy, with Bachira potentially being the final nail in the coffin in a callback to how Nagi was the one to trash talk Bachira back in the 4v4 of second selection, when Bachira didn't know what to do with his ego. Though another key detail in why Nagi needs to get locked off is hidden in the scenes where he asks to Ryo to give him a new hit. The fact that Nagi acknowledges himself that he's not currently going at the same speed as his rivals. And this is another key detail of why Nagi needs to leave Blue Lock. Nagi is a character that never really went at the same speed as other characters, going too fast at times and too slow at others. In a sense, what Nagi needs is to go at his own pace, because the pace set by Blue Lock is not fit for his current self, since Nagi's struggles are way different than that of other characters in the story. Whereas other characters have already had their hit for a long time, or at least have stakes in their lives, Nagi has had nothing for the majority of his life. This is actually what leads him to make mistakes in his judgments of his ego. He's actively discovering most of what his emotions are when he's feeling them for the first time, and this is an important detail to then understand why Nagi is currently moving at such a slow pace. Because Nagi is finding things out for the first time, he is ignorant of not only how the world works and how people do, but also of how he is and who he is. This is most prevalent in episode Nagi, where most of the time Nagi seems to come close to an answer or a feeling of finding a new hit. He then takes a lot of time to process this feeling. But with all of this, a certain amount of foolishness arises. The most telling example of all this is the fact that Nagi seems to have never asked himself what exactly does he desire or what should he do past just living an easy life and his dream of beating Isagi. Whenever Nagi is put into a harsh situation, instead of thinking what should I do, he'll be thinking what would Ryo or Isagi do, showing that he's not directly understanding his ego past the moment where it arises out of instinct. Though, as Isagi said himself, to create a strong ego, you must first work upon challenges that are unique to your reality and goals, something that Nagi has only done so far with his dream of beating Isagi. So with all this, if Nagi were to continue in Blue Lock, it would make a narrative issue where the story allows a character who directly goes against the philosophy of the program to continue playing. To quote directly Ego Jibachi, "Back when we started this neo-egoist league, do you recall what I said was the key to victory? Proving your originality. What is originality? Originality is hunger. A hunger that Nagi not only currently lacks, but that he also doesn't understand. So how can he survive in the NEL in his current state? Now you just might be asking yourself, if Nagi is meant to be locked off, then is it the end of his story? Will he just become a character meant to be a lesson of what happens to geniuses who don't have the right mentality? And to this I answer no. If anything, Nagi's story may only truly start past this moment. The first light to the idea that Nagi's story doesn't end at just a lock-off is the fact that Nagi has his own spin-off which could tell us his story outside of Blue Lock. The second thing is that we have used Chris Priest's quote a lot, but another important detail is that he said that he used to be this way himself. Meaning that even from having gotten to ruination because of him not understanding his talent, he was able to rise back up until becoming the best striker in the world, well, after Noel Noah. One final key detail is that while Igo Jinpachi is the manager of Blue Lock, he isn't the one who holds the highest power over the team. That would be the Japanese Football Association. And we saw how they would be ready to put anyone on the U20 team if it meant Sae would play, which would give a huge increase in their revenue. So if Nagi is able to become a player whose popularity becomes so big that Japanese Football Association absolutely want him in the national team, then Igo Jinpachi will be forced to roll with it. With this, most of the video is over with. There are other details I would like to give that I couldn't fit well enough in the video, so here they are. The first is another argument about Nagi potentially leaving Blue Lock, but also where he might end up after the NEL. Right before Igo Jinpachi talks about what is talent, he talks about why Japanese football can change. The fact that the Japanese Football Association creates prodigies for their marketing and hype up said prodigies for revenue, only for them to then fade away and play domestic leagues. Of course, the prodigies fading away talk was again a callback to Nagi's current situation, but the part I want to talk the most is how the prodigies then end up in domestic leagues. So with this, we can imagine that Nagi's club after the NEL may be a J-League club and that he might even see Kira at one point, who knows. And it would make sense that Nagi would first need to get past Japan before heading on to the world class. Secondly, I want to talk about Reo and most notably a key trait of Reo, the fact that he gets everything he wants. Not always at the time he does, but he always gets what he wants in the end. Reo wanted for Nagi to say that he needs him and Nagi did. But Reo also wanted to become someone that Nagi would want to chase after. So is this another foreshadowing of Nagi needing to build himself back up from the bottom to chase after Reo? And finally, now this may be a bit of a reach, and I'm honestly ad-libbing this, but there have been some parallels with Naruhaya, and most notably a panel where we see Nagi's aura looking oddly similar, even downright to the way he puts his hand onto Naruhaya. And another thing is that in the episode Nagi, rendition of the 2v2, we see how Nagi then asks himself, will I look like he does when this eventually ends? And so who knows, maybe we might see Nagi crying, who knows. Anyway, with this the video is finally over. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any more questions about this theory or generally want to interact with me and the community, you can hop on in the Discord server of the channel. It'll be a pleasure to have you there. Have a great one, fellow egoists.